I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Dr. Kevin Riehle, Associate Professor at the University of Mississippi Center for Intelligence and Security Studies. Dr. Riehle literally wrote the book on Russian intelligence, along with a definitive book on Soviet defectors, as well as dozens of papers on Russian espionage, spycraft, military strategy, and Cold War history. Dr. Riehle's career includes over 30 years of experience in intelligence and counterintelligence roles with the Defense Intelligence Agency, U.S. European Command, and the FBI, culminating in the position of Senior Policy Officer at the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. Dr. Riehle has a BA in Russian and Political Science from Brigham Young University, an MS in Strategic Intelligence from the Joint Military Intelligence College, and a PhD in War Studies from King's College London, as well as a diploma from the Command and Staff Program at the U.S. Naval War College. He's also the recipient of numerous awards and honors. So, Kevin, welcome. And let me start by thanking you for your tremendous career of service. It is truly an honor to have you here today. I want to start out by asking, what inspired you to develop such a tremendous expertise in Russian intelligence, spycraft, and military strategy?
First of all, I'll say I'm probably not the utmost expert in those things, but what brought me to that was, first of all, just an academic interest in Russia. I've been studying Russia in an academic sense since my undergraduate time. I studied the language and the politics of Russia during the Cold War, and then my master's degree I finished just after the Cold War ended. So I've been academically looking at that for a while. And then in my career, I was able to view intelligence services across a number of countries and how they worked and what threat they posed to U.S. interests. And so putting those two things together, I have gained an interest then in specifically looking at Russian intelligence and how it operates around the world, what its priorities are, and where we might be able to do something about it.
Yeah, well, so our focus today is Russia's war in Ukraine, right? And it's been all over the headlines this year. I've read that Russia's invasion of Ukraine may have been provoked by Ukraine's interest in joining NATO, whereas Ukraine's interest in NATO was to prevent a Russian invasion. Is that kind of what started the current conflict, or is there more to the story?
There's a lot more to the story than that. The conflict has origins much earlier than Ukraine's interest in NATO. Russia's use of World War II rhetoric, such as Nazism or even a pre-World War II phrase, Novorossiya, which means New Russia, or Russia's description of Kiev as the root of Russian culture, all demonstrate a much deeper Russian motive than just NATO. That's not to say that NATO membership for Ukraine isn't important, though, as it does have something to do with it. Ukraine as a NATO member would be a critical loss for Russia. It would be a loss to Russian prestige, a loss to Russia's security, and especially a loss to one of Russia's goals of controlling the post-Soviet space. It would possibly inspire other post-Soviet states like Georgia, which already also aspires to NATO membership, to push even harder toward that goal. So Ukraine as a NATO member would be a significant security concern for Russia. But the conflict is deeper than that. It's those who say that it really is simply a reaction to NATO need to look a little further than just that.
Well, this is something I've wondered about as well. And another thing I've wondered about is the timing of this. I've wondered why Russia chose to invade in 2022. And going back to the NATO thing, which has been in the media, Ukraine has openly wanted to join NATO since 2002. And in 2017, the Ukrainian parliament adopted legislation that reinstating membership in NATO was a strategic foreign and security policy objective. So, I've been wondering what created, I guess, that urgency that caused this invasion this year. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, in reality, Russia's been at war with Ukraine since 2014. Russia's used military capabilities in Ukraine, like direct support to insurgents in eastern Ukraine, covert assassinations of Ukrainian military leaders, remote attacks on Ukraine's critical infrastructure since 2014. So the rhetoric that Russian leaders use, including Putin himself, about this particular time really it's not unique. Russia's been preparing for this for a while. Even on top of that, there have been revelations of Russian intelligence illegals being caught in several places in Europe, and just in 2022, two in particular, one in Norway and one in the Netherlands, both showed some preparation for the invasion before the invasion began, particularly the preparation for a potential diplomatic backlash, which did in fact occur in 2022. An individual named Viktor Cherkasov applied for a position at the International Criminal Court in the Netherlands in late 2021. He didn't arrive until April of 2021, but his application for that, April of 2022, but his application for that was submitted months earlier. Then another individual, Mikhail Mikushin, arrived at the Arctic University in Norway in November 2021. Those were both GRU officers under illegal cover in European countries. And they showed that Russia was preparing for the potential need for illegals as a fallback before the military activities occurred. The FSB also provided the Russian leadership with assessments about Russia's prospects for success. And the FSB concluded that it would be an easy victory. And Western media reported that an FSB case officer who had handled clandestine sources inside Ukraine even mentioned on the phone that he had an apartment picked out in Kiev where he was going to move in when the Ukrainian government fell. So the confidence level was high. Covert and clandestine Russian activities have been ongoing for years in Ukraine. So the 2022 military invasion really just brought that covert action out into the open more than it had been previously. So the question really that comes from that then is why 2022 specifically? I would say that Russia felt like it was prepared to succeed. It had that FSB assessment. Military modernization had been ongoing in Russia since 2008 in earnest, since Russia's invasion of Georgia, when Russia did in fact defeat Georgia, but Georgia was a much smaller military, and Russia's military didn't perform that well in Georgia, even though it was able to defeat a smaller power. So Russia began its modernization, both of its weapons systems and of its military structure around that time, and it has poured billions of dollars into that military. It has conducted major strategic exercises every year for about the last 12 years, in which it supposedly tested that military capability, although those military exercises really were more play acting than they were real tests. Another factor was that there were divisions in the EU. One of Russia's goals is to disrupt and divide NATO and the EU. And particularly after a pandemic, the EU was struggling economically, politically. There were deep divisions about how EU was to portray Russia, or to what relations the EU was to have with Russia. So all of those things together persuaded Russia that it was time. It was that things were all in place to go. The preparations were done. The adversary wasn't really unified. On top of that, after 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, the Western reaction wasn't that egregious. I mean, the West did apply sanctions. NATO reinforced the eastern flank, but the West didn't militarily respond directly to Russia. So Russia felt it was ready. and it could get away with it.
Ah, okay. Well, and I wanted to come back and touch later on the current state of Russia's military, which you already touched on briefly. But um, so about a month after Russia invaded Ukraine, you published an article entitled Recent Statements Indicating Russia is Planning a Preemptive War Against NATO, which suggested that Putin may be planning to provoke a confrontation with the West. So do you think that the current conflict might be a prelude to something larger? Or does Russia consider this a limited and possibly even defensive engagement to, again, prevent NATO encirclement?
Well, at the beginning of the conflict, the answer to that question may be different than it is today.
Hmm.
That confidence level was still high early in the conflict, even though the Russian military performance pretty quickly was shown to be poor. Russian confidence in its abilities didn't degrade immediately. And so those statements in the first month or so of the conflict may have been intended to pump Russia up, for Russia to pump its chest and say, "Yeah, come at us. We're coming at you. So watch out." But since then, Russia's performance has not been as positive, and Russia's confidence has waned. So the rhetoric continues to be similar. The rhetoric about this being a conflict against NATO, not necessarily a conflict against Ukraine solely, that still is the language that Russian leaders use. Just a few days ago, for example, a Russian pop singer released a song about the Russian nuclear missile, the Sarmat, as it's called. The song called the Sarmatushka. And that song was about Russia's ability to obliterate Washington, D.C. This was a pop song where Russia is bragging about its opportunity to attack NATO, attack the United States in particular. Russian propaganda still describes this invasion as a defensive measure. Russian leaders always use defensive terms to describe their own actions. They never claim that Russia is the aggressor. That has been the case during the Cold War. That was the case. But Russia's propaganda rhetoric and nuclear saber rattling are themselves probably less partially defensive, but partially also deterrent. Russia uses fear to prevent the West from directly militarily engaging in Ukraine. If NATO were to intervene in Ukraine, the conflict would likely be over quickly. But Russian military leaders know that. And if they can hold the risk of nuclear retaliation over the heads of NATO leaders, they can create enough doubt that NATO will hold off. So it's a mix of just chest thumping and defensiveness and deterrence. And that rhetoric continues without any reduction.
A delicate position. Well, so speaking of rhetoric, I wanted to touch on Ukraine's two easternmost regions of Luhansk and Donetsk, which are commonly known as the Donbas. So the Russian military announced a goal back in March of what they called liberation of the Donbas. And some polls have found support by citizens in these regions wanting to join Russia. So, do you think this might be a causal factor? Or again, is this just kind of a justification in terms of rhetoric?
Russia's been talking about liberating the Donbas and other portions of Ukraine since 2014. So that rhetoric isn't really that different than it has been. There is, in fact, a cultural divide in Ukraine, with the East being more inclined toward Russia politically, linguistically, historically, than Western Ukraine is. That is a fact that Ukraine has lived with since its independence. And Ukraine has struggled with the decision of which direction it will lean politically. Will it lean toward Russia or will it lean toward the West? In fact, the Maidan revolution in 2013-14 was spurred by a decision by then Ukrainian president, who was Russian-leaning, to move away from signing an EU association agreement. So he made the decision that Russia would lean eastward rather than westward, and that then sparked a revolution that removed him from power and has really led to where we are today. But Russia's narrative about liberating really bears little resemblance to the reality on the ground. It requires a great deal of manipulation for it to sound accurate. Russia's language conflicts with, for example, the number of people from that region of Ukraine who have fled and become refugees because they want to avoid Russian occupation, or the number of people who have reportedly been forcibly taken from that region into Russia to remove them from the region. So the also has to take into account the intensity of Russian state security presence in that region that keeps the people in line and it keeps the region from spinning out of control. So
yeah, and if I could interject for a moment, when I mentioned polls, that was one of the things that I found while I was doing research. The polls seem to vary wildly, right? And so presumably they've been manipulated. I found some that were very much in favor of Ukraine's position, others that were very much in favor of Russia's position. And so, I should just put that out there, that in terms of anything citing polls, I didn't get the impression that those were highly reliable, but it did seem to be an indicator of some kind.
And that those polls are an indication of just really how split the region is. The region does have an identity crisis, and those polls reflect that.
Yeah. Well, based on the current state of conflict, and I guess this is probably the biggest question right now, who do you think will win this war? Or do you think it'll end up becoming some kind of what they call a frozen conflict?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball any more than anyone else does, but I think who wins depends on patience. Europe's patience is on one side and Russia's patience is on the other. And then the people of Ukraine also factor into that in their patience. On European side, how long can the European people last in their support for Ukraine while experiencing questions about their energy supply, while experiencing inflation? How long are they willing to live in that situation, in that situation of doubt, until they start pushing their governments to reduce support for Ukraine? The Ukrainian people are on another factor. How long can they last under intense bombardment and destruction of their critical infrastructure? I mean, the stories we're hearing about the amount, the time that the lights are turned on in Ukraine, or the availability of water in certain parts of Ukraine, the people of Ukraine are suffering. And how long are they willing to accept that suffering? They have an inspirational leader who has thus far kept them strong. But how long can they last? That's another question of patience. And the third question is, we've heard a lot about Russia's inability to sustain its military invasion, about Russia running out of ammunition. Although those rumors have been floating around for a while now, some predictions have said that Russia could run out of small arms ammunition as early as within a month or two. So really, the question of who wins is the question of who lasts longer. And at the moment, it appears that Russia's rhetoric about outlasting the adversary may be bolder than its actual capabilities. The resilience of the Ukrainian people is probably stronger than Russia's military sustainment. So, go ahead.
Yeah, I've read that Putin has quote unquote staked his presidency on the invasion. But I've also read that Russia anticipated the invasion to proceed a lot more easily than it has. So do you think that could lead to a withdrawal or ceasefire? Or do you think that they're politically committed in a way that precludes them kind of backing out from it?
Russia, as you point out, Putin staking his presidency on this invasion really precludes an easy answer.
Yeah.
That Putin can't now back out. He can't say, well, we've been fighting the Nazis in Ukraine. We've been fighting the evil Ukrainians for all this time, but they're okay now, so we're going to back out. He just can't say that because his credibility would be too damaged by that. He at this point, and there's a lot of analysis that is pointing toward this. At the end of this conflict will probably spell the end of Vladimir Putin, one way or the other. If Russia loses, Vladimir Putin can't stand for much longer. There have even been assessments, and I think these may be a little bit exaggerated, that Russia could disintegrate, similarly to how the Soviet Union disintegrated in 1991. If Russia were to lose, that pieces of the Russian Federation could actually split off. That may be exaggerated, but Putin has placed so much of his own credibility in this at this point that it would be hard for him ever to back out. And the rhetoric he has used with all the discussions about negotiations, I think, bear that out. His bottom line in the negotiations has been, we keep all our territories and you get nothing. And if he were to say anything else, he will be seen as weak.
Yeah. Well, so I wanted to ask, you'd mentioned earlier about modernization in the Russian military, and it seems like the Ukraine conflict has a lot of lessons that it can teach the West about Russia's current military. So based on what you've seen, how has Russia's military changed? I mean, since the Cold War, you've mentioned that they were modernizing. And has the current conflict validated any of our intelligence estimates of where they're at?
Probably just to the contrary, actually. They probably threw our intelligence estimates into question, because many of our intelligence estimates predicted that Russia was much stronger than it has appeared on the battlefield. In 2017, the Defense Intelligence Agency published an unclassified, openly available assessment of Russia's military. And it portrayed a Russian military that was very capable and that had tested many of its capabilities in places like Syria and in insurgent warfare in eastern Ukraine. And it had learned lessons from Georgia. And all of those events seemed to compile together to make Russia a very capable military presence. The question then was, why, with that assessment, why has Russia performed so poorly? And there's a few reasons for that. One is we may have just had it wrong, and Russia itself may have had it wrong. More importantly, really, that Russia believed its own rhetoric, that it was strong and that it could defeat a NATO adversary if faced with one. And Russia, I mentioned earlier the grand strategic exercises that were held annually, and rotated around 4 different major military regions in Russia. They practiced Russia's ability to integrate its military forces. They practiced communication. They practiced even the use of strategic weapons to end the conflict. But they were heavily scripted. And they didn't place really any test on the military forces. The military forces drove their tanks exactly where they were supposed to. They took nice video of their tanks crossing the steppe lands or wherever they were, and they posted those videos to the internet saying, look how strong our tanks are. But in reality, they didn't place the military under any real world conditions.
Well, you're kind of talking about, I believe, what they call the fog of war, right? Where, like, for instance, one of the things that I've seen in the media is a high casualty rate for Russian officers. Although, from what I understand, they actually use officers in place of what we would call NCOs, non-commissioned officers. So that's it's not necessarily a one for one because more of their officers are in harm's way, right?
Russia's military personnel structure is different than ours. Yes, so the Russian military officers are handled differently. A junior officer, a junior lieutenant or a lieutenant, is going to be used for different reasons, different missions in the Russian military than a lieutenant would be used in a Western military. But one of the problems that they're having is, in addition to that, in addition to the officers being more forward placed, is that they just didn't anticipate the ability of Ukraine to reach further behind their lines. So some of those officer losses have been actually in the rear of the Russian military, where Russia has been able to use the NATO supplied missiles to soften up those rear areas. So it's a mix of just how Russia applies its military and the level of technology that has been provided to Ukraine.
Ah, well, and so, I wanted to switch gears a little bit and ask about, I think, a couple of the big mysteries of this conflict, at least from what I've read. The first one is the Nord Stream 1 and 2 gas pipeline sabotage. So Russia apparently cut deliveries through these over the summer, right? I mean, the conflict was already underway, so there were many reasons for that. And neither of these was delivering methane when the explosions occurred, but both were pressurized, which has led to a very large environmental disaster. But from what I've been able to read, it doesn't appear that anyone has claimed credit for sabotaging these. Do you have any thoughts on who might have done this?
No one's claimed credit, that's for sure. And the Swedish and Danish investigations into it have not conclusively determined any perpetrator at this point. But it does appear at first glance. No, let me back up one step. Russia has claimed the United States did it. Russia has pointed fingers at the United States, saying, look at how this benefits the United States. If there is no Nord Stream, the United States will be able to ship more gas to Europe. And it obviously, from Russia's perspective, the U.S. benefits from this. But from another direction, it would appear at first glance that it could have also been a Russian covert operation. In fact, probably more likely a Russian covert operation. If it was, the operation places Russian short-term goals ahead of its long-term trade relations. Russia benefits most in the short term from it. Damage to the pipeline further threatens Europe's, especially Germany's, energy security. So along with the other threats that Russia has made about cutting off its energy supplies, Russia can say, well, you're not getting any of our gas, so you go ahead and freeze to death for all we care. So that it fits into Russia's narrative in the short term. But sabotaging the pipeline would also cause long-term damage to Europe's confidence in Russian imports. So it may have a short-term benefit if Russia is behind it, but it would have long-term disadvantages. If Russia was behind it, Russia would be relying on that question of patience that I mentioned earlier. How long can Europe hold out without these supplies of gas? If Europe can't hold out, then they will start to find ways to fix the pipeline and to get the gas flowing again. But if Russia on the battlefield can outlast energy supplies, then that would be to Russia's advantage. nevertheless, in the long term, a number of things Russia has done since its invasion of Ukraine look to be short-term gains for long-term disadvantage. Some of it, a number of its long-term goals seem to be taking a step backward with its invasion of Ukraine, even if in the short term, Russia may have some advantage over Ukraine. So if it fits in with all the other things that Russia has been doing and to its short-term advantage, it would point toward Russia being the saboteur, or Russian, probably the GRU, being Russian military being the saboteur. But at this point, the investigation has not conclusively determined that.
Yeah. Well, and I think the other big unanswered question is where China stands in this. Do you think that there's some kind of a joint geopolitical strategy at work here? And the reason I ask that is, China has ambitions with Taiwan. There's been a lot of saber rattling over the last couple of years, especially during the pandemic. Russia is choosing to pursue these territorial goals with Ukraine now. Do you think that there's some kind of collusion or cooperation between them? Or again, do you think that there may initially have been, and the setbacks may have changed that strategy?
Well, China has not exactly sat on the fence. It has taken Russia's side diplomatically. It has taken Russia's side economically in accepting Russia's energy supplies in the face of sanctions. So China hasn't fully supported the West by any means, and it has been openly supporting Russia. But China stands to gain from a weakened Russia. China has no desire for NATO to win over Russia, but China would also not stand in the way of a declining Russia. China would benefit from Russia's decline in Central Asia, from Russia's decline in Europe, where China could walk through that open door that's left by Russia's decreased influence and take some of that itself. So openly, China has been supportive, but in the background, China would have no problem if Russia were to fall.
Well, Kevin, let me thank you again so much for your time today, as well again for your career of service to our nation. So let me close by asking, what comes next for you? What are your focus areas in the near term? And what do you anticipate potentially happening next with Russia's war in Ukraine?
Well, start with the last question. What will happen next with Russia's war in Ukraine is that question of patience. Will the predictions of Russia's military supplies running out come true? If that's the case, then that will have a significant impact on the battlefield, and obviously to Russia's disadvantage. So that's really the next thing to watch: is how can Russia continue to supply its military, and then monitoring Europe's resilience as well. I mean, those two things are really what we need to watch over the next few months. For me, I am teaching courses, which I enjoy doing. I'm also doing research toward the second half of the Defector book that I published in 2020. That book went up to the mid-1950s, and I'm picking it up from there and studying defectors since then. So I also have some other writing projects on Russia's Federal Security Service that are in the process, and as well as some other projects on Russian intelligence and security services. So that's where I'm headed, and I think there's a lot of fun in the future.
Wonderful. Kevin, thank you again so much for your time today, sir.
Pleasure.